Good morning, and also good afternoon. I know we have a lot of people who've joined us both in Kiev, Washington, Brussels, but also online. We've sort of had a number of inquiries over the last several days about how to tune in to this event. My name is Jonathan Katz. I'm a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund in the United States. I want to thank all of my colleagues at the German Marshall Fund in Brussels, the Reanimation Package of Reforms in Kiev, and the Ukraine Crisis Media Center as well, Ukrainian World Congress and U.S.-Ukraine Foundation for their role in this event, but also and making certain that that the lines of communication between Washington, Brussels, and Ukraine are alive and well. We're pleased that you could join us. This is the 5th meeting of the Transatlantic Task Force on Elections and Civil Society in Ukraine. With our distinguished speakers today in Kiev, we're going to focus on the first and second round of Ukraine's presidential election. The second round will take place on April 21st. And I had the distinct honor 2 weeks ago now of joining NDI's election observation mission to Ukraine. And I spent several days in Vinnytsia as an observer and got to see firsthand really what many of us thought was a well-run election. And I saw, as I said, I saw firsthand Ukrainians going to the polls. I saw how contested it was, and it was certainly a crowded field. Might be the longest ballot for a presidential election that I've ever seen. The outcome was as close as expected, with Volodymyr Zelensky and Petro Poroshenko receiving the highest proportions of the vote. I will just say that with NDI. I'll just read a little bit from their statement that the election was genuinely competitive. Voters turned out in higher numbers than in 2014 for the presidential poll. For the second time since the Revolution of Dignity, despite ongoing Russian aggression, Ukraine held an election that broadly reflects the will of voters and meets key international standards. However, there are many important opportunities to promote public confidence by improving the electoral process, and I think as part of that delegation, and absolutely agree. We also know that prior to that election, and I think it's still the same today, that there was what we saw was a frustration amongst Ukrainian voters about the state of economy, about the state of reforms, about the ongoing conflict in the East. And when we look at that, we know those issues are still front and center going into the second round of the election. And I'm really looking forward today to the task force event today and our speakers who are going to discuss the outcome of that election, including election conduct, touch on Russian interference, Ukrainian voter priorities, as well as touch on the final round of the presidential election. So with only 2 candidates remaining, I guess the questions are, what are Ukrainian presidential candidates emphasizing to win over undecided Ukrainian voters and set the stage for Ukraine's next steps 5 years after the Maidan? And also, what do we expect to see over the next 2 weeks? And is the Ukrainian government and people prepared for the second round? And I have to say, I'm sure I'm not the only one who thought that there's been a lot of excitement in the second round already with the idea that there may be presidential debates. We saw both candidates receiving drug tests. I don't think I've ever seen that in an election before. But we know that, again, this is highly contested, and we're looking forward to hearing from our colleagues. Just by way of background, the Transatlantic Task Force on Elections and Civil Society in Ukraine was established in October 2018 by the Friends of Ukraine Network, Democracy and Civil Society Task Force, which I co-chair along with Oris and my colleague Adrian here as well, and the Reanimation Package of Reforms. And really, this was set to provide a platform for stronger U.S., EU, Ukrainian, and international engagement and information in the lead up and following the Ukrainian presidential election and until the parliamentary election in October. So I think we've kept this moving in the right direction. And thank you to our partners in Brussels and Kiev and then also those who are joining us online as well. I want to turn it over to my task force co-chair, Oris, for introducing our speakers in Kiev. Oris.
Thank you, Jonathan. And let me join Jonathan in welcoming all of you. I'm going to say a few words from my perspective as having been an OSCE observer this time around. I'm not going to delve into the hot topic of the day, namely the results of the election, including the whole debate saga or questions or fears about Zelensky or whatnot. But I do want to touch upon the more mundane but still very important issue of the conduct of the elections. So this was an election that was run mostly fairly with few serious violations. It was assessed positively by the OSCE and other international election observation missions, including NDI, IRI, the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, the World Ukrainian Congress, and others. And all of the international observers reached the same broad conclusion. I think that while by no means completely perfect or completely problem-free, especially during the campaign period, it was a competitive election with fundamental freedoms that were generally respected and that met international democratic standards. Whether one likes the results or not, it did reflect the will of the Ukrainian people. Now, OSCE had the largest international mission with nearly 1,000 observers from 45 countries deployed all over government-controlled Ukraine. OSCE's become the gold standard in international election observation methodology. It's a pretty large and sophisticated operation, both logistically and substantively. Observers filled out thousands of standardized forms electronically via e-pen. That was a new experience for this observer, that were then transmitted directly to the mission's headquarters in Kyiv, where statistical analyses were performed, forming the basis for the day after preliminary statement that was issued at the press conference, OSCE press conference. So my experience as an OSCE observer in Mykolaiv mirrored that of other observers across the country. The election day voting itself was assessed positively in 99% of the stations observed. You can't get much better than that, obviously. Now, the percentages weren't quite as good in observations of the count and the tabulation, although the large majority were still judged positively. But any problems in these were more, it seems to me, along the lines of the category of irregularities rather than, some devious attempts to manipulate results. So there were very few, I think, serious violations. Let me make one pitch, and I know this is maybe getting into the weeds, but especially for the Kyiv audience and people involved there. Regarding the tabulation of the results at the district election commissions, the process is simply too cumbersome and inefficient, with frustrated polling precinct station workers having to wait hours and hours on end and at times overcrowded conditions. I witnessed this myself, staying up all night. And when we got out of there at 7 a.m. in the morning, only a relatively small number of tabulations had occurred. So it's a very cumbersome process and needs to be changed, I think. More significantly, in terms of improvements that are needed, is electoral reform, which still has not passed the Rada, even though it was introduced nearly 1.5 years ago. And many of the OSCE's and other European institution and IRI and NDI and whatnot recommendations that followed earlier elections have yet to be implemented. So there's still work to be done. But having said all that, and no matter what the shortcomings of the process, Ukraine again showed its strong commitment to democracy. This irritated Moscow to no end, judging, for instance, by their TV coverage that not only lied about, ridiculed, and denigrated the election process, but also demeaned Ukrainians. On the other hand, the positive conduct of the elections increased the confidence of Ukraine's international friends and partners of Ukraine's commitment to a brighter, democratic Euro-Atlantic future. And this, I think, is ultimately what matters. And no matter who's elected president, and yes, it will probably be a bit more challenging in the event of a Zelensky victory. But no matter what, the West, I think, still needs to continue to support Ukraine, and especially Ukraine's civil society. And with that, I'll turn it back to Jonathan.
Boris, thank you. And I couldn't agree more. I think the example of the election across the border in Russia was well taken. There was a Moscow Times headlines that had sort of Russians wish they were Ukrainians, and it was an article written about the conduct of the elections and how Russians have not been given the same choice, the same democratic choice that Ukrainians have been given. And so I think it was an excellent example. And of course, from here in Washington, the fact that we had robust delegations, both from Washington with a number of organizations, but from Ukraine's international partners, shows you the interest and desire to continue to support Ukraine. And of course, as Kurt Volker recently said, the United States will work with whomever becomes president of Ukraine. And of course, we'll find out in a couple of weeks. If I can, I really want to turn it over, and I'm just going to read quickly the bios for our speakers in Kiev. Olga Ayvazovska, who is the head of the board of the civil network OPORA, a civil society organization that catalyzes change in Ukraine by engaging citizens in decision-making and fighting for the protection of voting rights and transparent election process. I know it's been an incredibly busy time for you, and so we deeply appreciate that you're here. And I know that you have a deep history. I know you've worked with a number of nonpartisan observation missions in Ukraine. You've worked with tens of thousands of activists, participated in electoral observation in more than 10 countries across Europe, and from 2017 to 2018 represented Ukraine in the Trilateral Contact Group. Thank you, Olga. Thank you for being here. And then we also I'll turn to Ina Borzilo, is the Chief Executive Officer of Center UA NGO in Ukraine, has worked in the public sector since 2012, joined Center UA team as the PR manager of Chesno's civil society movement, and later has worked as a project director of Chesno until she was promoted to the position of CEO of Center UA in October 2014. You were also deeply involved previously as part of the Reanimation Package of Reform Coalition. You worked as a civil journalist, TV presenter on Hradska TV. We really appreciate that you're here. Oleksiy Haran is a professor at the National University of Kiev Mola Academy. Since 2015, he has been the research director at the Democratic Initiatives Foundation, one of the oldest Ukrainian think tanks. He's a member of the Council on National Unity under the President of Ukraine, and a member of the Washington-based program on new approaches to research and security, PONARS. Oleksiy, thank you for being here. Last but not least, we have Galyna Petrenko, is a director at the prominent NGO Detector Media, as a journalist and media expert with more than 15 years of experience. Ms. Petrenko previously worked as editor-in-chief of the Detector Media website, deputy editor-in-chief, and the marketing media review editor-in-chief of the new marketing magazine in Ukraine and Russia. We have, I think, 4 of the most distinguished speakers from Ukrainian civil society who've spent the last several weeks and months before and after the election looking at a number of the challenging issues that are front and center of this election. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleagues in Kiev to pick up from here and to moderate the next part of this panel.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Oris, for your remarks, for your comments. So, dear colleagues, before we start with the Kiev panel, I just want to have a 30 seconds update from RPR. So, the Reanimation Package of Reforms at the biggest Ukraine CSO or NGO coalition. We developed back in at the end of 2018 the communication policy that we do not support any political party or candidate, and we are fully unbiased on this or any other elections, right? That was the first very important point. And the second very important point is, you know that the biggest debate now on Ukraine's election is actually the debate between two candidates. And last week, we as RPR board, so our managing board, released a statement that we as the coalition very much support this tool of democracy as debate, and we fully encourage both the candidates to take part in the debate as it is prescribed by Ukrainian legislation. And at least, as you all know, that the debate on Suspilne TV, Ukraine public broadcasting, should take place on the last Friday before the elections. Thank you. And basically, my first question is to Olga Ayvazovska, the chairwoman of the board of the civil network OPORA, as the biggest election watchdog in Ukraine. Olga actually is following Ukrainian elections as independent observer or coordinator of observers for more than 13 years. And with her experience, I would like to address this issue. Basically, my question was to Olga to compare the elections, the previous one, 2014, and this one, in terms of campaigning, the election day, and the counting process. Do you feel that this election were better, worse, or that's the same?
First of all, these elections were very competitive, and if you try to compare it with 2014, I think, and as we could assess, that competition between different candidates were on the highest level, and the number of violations decreased already. And when we try to assess the electoral day all over Ukraine, we saw that the number of violations decreased. Of course, there were some of the violation of the procedures or electoral law, but it was like a technical problems and issues which sometimes had connection with the understanding of the procedures or low capacity of the members of electoral commission. As you know, we had 39 candidates, and many of them had high-level representatives all over Ukraine. For example, 5 candidates had near 99% of the coverage on the 30,000 of the precinct election commissions. Of course, the understanding of the procedures is very important for us as electoral process bureaucrats, but sometimes the violation of procedures doesn't mean that it was a falsification or systematic violation with some criminal objectives for those people who didn't work step by step according to the position of the law. At the same time, we collected the data about violation of the secret voting or photos of the ballots, and as we know, there were opened even criminal cases, especially against high-level politicians, which showed their ballots openly. I don't believe that we will have result of these criminal cases because some of these people had their MPs, and of course it's not so easy to investigate because of immunity. But I hope that they will have administrative penalties and we will see the results till the second round. I think that our international partners and media and law enforcement bodies did a great job for prevention of the serious violation. First of all, I'm talking about the role on or influence or activity of the paramilitary group during election day, because we had such feeling and understanding from the ground that it might be a crucial tool for the changing of electoral field on the local level, but it didn't work, and it's a good case about prevention. From another hand, during electoral campaigning, we observe many cases about misusing of state budget resource, And it's a problem from one hand of Ukrainian practice, from another hand, it's a big gap in Ukrainian legislation, electoral legislation, and misunderstanding with the international standards on this topic. According to Venice Commission recommendation, during electoral process, it's not a good practice to open new social programs or financial programs, especially for poor social groups, but we collected the data about national-wide campaigning and the local campaigning. Of course, nobody could stop it. At the same time, I'm sure that these programs didn't work as well or effectively as candidates who had access to these resources hoped. That's why it's a good case, even for Ukrainian politicians. From another hand, it's like objective for a civil society organization to have smaller, bigger progress on a legal base. So that's all.
Thank you, Olga. I want to play the ball next to Oleksiy Haran, who is a professor at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and also the research director at Democratic Initiatives Foundation. Interesting fact is that, if I'm not wrong, it was for the 15th time when the Democratic Initiatives Foundation carried out the national exit poll, and this year as well. Professor, my question to you is about your assessment. How different is this campaign from the others, 2010, 2014, and what are the interesting facts about demography of voters or regional trends this year? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Is it okay now? Okay. Well, actually, I'm in election business since 1989, so I can talk a lot. But let me start with exit poll, because I think this is very important instrument tool of democratic control over elections, and we conducted it together with our traditional partners, the Razumkov Center and Kyiv International Institute of Sociology. There were also other exit polls. Our exit poll, by the way, was conducted by American, European, Canadian donors and Renaissance Foundation, and we will conduct the same exit poll for the runoff and also during the parliamentary elections. So we are very thankful for this support, because it really makes us independent from politicians or TV channels who are organizing their own exit polls. But the results of exit polls actually coincided with the result, not only with the results of CVK, Central Electoral Commission, but also it coincided more or less with the polls which were conducted in March before the elections by respectable sociological companies. So basically the trends were predictable. Now, what we have as a result? The winner of the first round is Mr. Zelensky. It's protest phenomenon. So this is clear, there's nothing surprising about that. We saw protest phenomenon in the United States, in the UK, and many other countries. So again, there's nothing new about that. The problem is about the inexperience of Zelensky and his team, because basically what's going on, he wants to actually to move from TV playground into presidential office. And here definitely there are some risks. This topic is also exploited by the team of Poroshenko, who used patriotic appeals in the electoral campaign. Poroshenko did a lot of reforms. He also didn't conduct also some reforms and made serious mistakes. So basically there are things which he can be praised, and also there's a lot of possibilities to criticize him, and all the candidates from opposition criticized him. His approach the accent on his ability to be commander-in-chief and to be a diplomat and to be able to lead the country in the time of war, it helped him to go into the second round. But we see that Zelensky has advantage, and a lot would depend on mobilization of the electorate of those who voted for other candidates. Regarding Boyka and Vilkul, which schematically may be called pro-Russian sympathizers, they would be neutral, they would abstain during the second round, or they will move to Zelensky. But the most interesting thing is what will happen with the so-called patriotic electorate. And here I mean post-Maidan electorate, or post-revolutionary electorate, which is traditionally supporting traditionally supported Maidan 1 and Maidan 2. And here we have the electors of Tymoshenko, of Gritsenko, of Smishko, of Koshulinsky, and even of Leshko, I lump it together. The problem is basically that we see that these leaders, again, they took either neutral position, formally neutral position, or they demonstrated in some or other way that they had a preference for Zelensky, which could lead to a very interesting results, or may not lead to interesting results. And here we have the results of 2010. Gritsenko, who was there at that time as well, they actually didn't call their supporters to vote for Tymoshenko. They called either to be neutral or to vote against both. At that time, most voters of this part of the electorate didn't listen to what their candidates said. Most of them voted to Tymoshenko because Tymoshenko was ideologically closer to them. So basically, an interesting thing is what will happen this time. The polls which were done before the first round, they showed that this electorate is split. We do not have new recent results after the first round, so we may only guess. So the question is, well, what would their voters do? Either they took neutral position, either they side with Zelensky, or either they will support Poroshenko as ideologically more close to them. One of the problems for Tymoshenko is also the quite low turnout in Western Ukraine, which is traditional base for national Democrats. So to sum it up, I would say that for Poroshenko, that now Zelensky has advantage, not only because of the results of the first round, but also of the position of the third candidates. But we will see. Again, in Ukraine, it's electors who finally decide, not the candidates and not the calls from those who lost in the first round. Now, about some positive thing. First of all, there's no regional split of Ukraine as it was in 2004 and 2010. There was no regional split in 2014, and now we also see that more or less even share of support for different candidates. Definitely, there are regional differences, and there are serious regional differences. But it's not about polarization that country is split. My second point is that all leading candidates, they, at least in their rhetoric, they were pro-European. And we see now that Zelensky also is supporting EU and NATO and even Thomas. No more jokes about that. So we may say that this is not the revenge of anti-Maidan. And definitely the problems with Zelensky is his inexperience and inexperience of his team. So in case if he wins the victory, there would be a lot of questions and a lot of challenges, which also Mr. Putin may use. But at the same time, I think that there are so profound changes in the country which happened after the Revolution of Dignity, there are so profound change in geopolitical views of Ukrainians regarding the EU and NATO that then it would be even difficult, you know, to move the country in the other direction. So this is on the positive side, and I would end with TV debates. We need TV debates, we need real TV debates, not a show. And we need it not only for us as experts and journalists, not only even for electors, because I think the nucleus, the debates will not influence the nucleus of the electorate of Zelensky and Poroshenko. It's more about the electorate of other candidates. But we need these debates also to control the future president. What he will be saying during these debates, his promises, his ideas, we will control it after the elections, whoever will win. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor Haran. As our previous speakers mentioned, that basically the campaign was very competitive. And my next question goes to Inna Borzilo, the Chief Executive Officer of Center UA NGO, which is one of the biggest watchdog NGOs in Ukraine. Do you share the same feeling that the campaign was really competitive? First one, and secondly, you are also monitoring the issue of political finances. How was it good? Was it bad? Was it clean and transparent in terms of political finances of candidates? I know you appealed to one of the candidates to disclose the e-declaration for 2018. Basically to Zelensky. Were you successful in it or not? Thank you.
Thank you, Vasyl. Briefly, Center UA and Chesna watchdog movement, we focused during this campaign on two aspects. Because and since we have the leader-oriented politics in Ukraine, and even Mr. Haran says that voters mostly vote for the personality, not for the programs, unfortunately, of the politicians, nevertheless, we focused on the analysis of political platforms, the programs of politicians, and on the analysis of political finances, of the expenditures and of electoral funds. What we can say in general, for example, I will start probably from political campaigns, and then how I will stop on how politicians collected the money to promote these ideas. So first of all, we can observe like the general trend during this election campaign that, of course, the main ideas of the candidates are quite populistic and quite attractive topics. The majority of candidates, they were talking about high wages, high salaries, high pensions, and at the same time very low tariffs for different unity fees and prices. Of course, we were promised to have free education, free medical health care, but politicians do not provide, unfortunately, any details how they will implement these ideas. And according again to the surveys, around 40% of Ukrainians, they do hope to find in the programs of presidential candidates the answers to security issues, the answers to Crimea reintegration, to the end of the solution of war conflict in the east of Ukraine. They are looking for these answers, but unfortunately they found very few information. Another trend when we analyze the programs is the quite high attention to socio-political, socio-economical issues. And as we know, according to the Constitution, the power to shape the policies in this area are owned by mostly parliament and government. And president do not have influence, very strong influence, of course. We do not count his right to initiate different draft laws and laws. He cannot, or he or she cannot influence the economics so directly. And a number of promises of candidates which we found, they were just are not in the president's power at all. and this is very, very pity. However, like from the quarter to the half of the programs, and we analyzed the programs of 10 top candidates, they were dedicated actually to the issues on which president has the limit power, and the direct areas of presidential responsibility such as security, foreign policies, international politics, for which president is directly responsible, they play much more modest role in the election programs. I don't know, maybe Ukrainians who are presented here or our colleagues from abroad have read the programs of politicians, but for you just to understand the level of rhetorics, we prepared as Chesna such newspapers in English, in Ukrainian, we were spreading them, and I will just quote some phrases. These are not jokes. Vasyl, you were asking for a joke. These are not jokes. Some phrases from the programs of the candidates. So some candidates promised us to provide every Ukrainian with a full fridge of meat and safe shawarma, to make sure that Ukrainian doctors and teachers don't leave for Poland to scrub toilets there, to rename the country Ukrainian People's Republic, to unite the church and the state, to hand out free bread daily, to create a tax haven and give out 5,000 hryvnias in subsidies to buy cows. So this is the level, unfortunately, of the discussion, and I think those voters who haven't decided, or let's call them liberal voters, democratic middle class of Ukrainians, when they read such programs, of course they feel frustrated because they don't see the candidates and they will vote again for the less evil on April 21. What else? Another popular direction of the program proposals is the distribution of power among the various authorities. So we have, and we see that number of candidates, they seek to amend the constitution and to adopt, or to adopt actually the new one, and to strengthen sometimes the role of the state, of the head of the state. When we are switching to the financial side, general observation that this campaign was the most transparent ever that we had in Ukraine, because even interim reports from the date of registration of the candidates to the March 18th, they covered this time slot. They were published timely, and we could analyze them. We did our best to spread the results of analysis. But this transparency doesn't mean the accountability and doesn't mean that we have the answers to all our questions. Because, for example, pre-term agitation, when candidates started, in fact, to promote their ideas themselves, their parties, months before being officially registered. Then hidden commercials, and I think Galyna will stop on this, the media, how they work during the election, polittechnologists, agitators, members of territorial and district voting commissions, they were all paid, but you will never find this data in the reports. And this is their situation when those who create actually the laws, they violate these laws themselves. They are the first one who will violate it. In general, few theses that this campaign was much more expensive than presidential campaign 2014. Even if this statement will not change, even if we will convert the size of electoral funds into the into dollars according to the rates of 2014, still this campaign will be more expensive. If we pay attention to the structure of expenditures from the presidential candidates' accounts, of course, the most popular channel to spend money is TV ads, and around 59% of all money of all candidates was spent on TV commercials. And again, we analyze the commercials of top 10 candidates, and sometimes their rhetoric on TV and their videos is quite different from their official programs. So sometimes if you read and then you watch, these are two different ideas which candidates promote. The second popular channel to spend money was outdoor ads, around 15%. of all electoral funds, then radio with 2%, then newspapers with again 2%, and some printed materials also actually have 15% of all money. And probably the pre-last thesis is about the structure or the models of filling the election funds of candidates. We observed three main scenarios. One is then candidate pays for his campaign himself. And this is, for example, the current president Petro Poroshenko, who is the only donor of his presidential campaign. And again, remember, when we were limiting the size of donation of physical person and of judicial, of the business, for example, to the electoral fund, the idea was to prevent the influence of one, for example, oligarch to the candidates. But we didn't count that the oligarchs can campaign themselves. And in this situation, Petro Poroshenko covers the 100% of his electoral fund. The second scenario is when candidate was supported with the funds of political parties. And for example, this is the model which Yulia Tymoshenko chose, and 100% of her campaign was supported by Batkivshina party. And the third scenario is actually the different mix, the different proportion of donations, of support from business, the own money of the candidates, and so on. What we will, of course, this is only pre-term analysis because we analyze the interim reports. We hope to get the final financial reports and the quarter reports of political parties next month. And then we will be ready to announce the final cost of one vote for some particular candidates and so on. But we need to understand that this hidden election funds which exist, and I mentioned for what needs it is usually used. It covers a lot of different and very important expenditures, and to make political finance not only transparent but accountable, we need some particular change to the legislation. First of all, as Olga already mentioned, this is election legislation and the law on political parties and the law on advertisement. Thank you. I will stop probably here.
Thank you, Inna, for such a broad perspective on the first round of elections. Actually, very important part of any election is debate and campaigning and media. Halina Petrenko is running the Detector Media NGO and is in the field as an expert for more than 15 years. Halina, I guess every Western-style democracy during the election period has one important thing, is equal access of candidates to media. Do you think that Ukraine is close to that? That's my first question. And second one, actually debates. When you switch Ukrainian TV now, you will get, I think, up to 7, 10, maybe a dozen different TV shows which is named presidential debates or whatsoever on different media run by different businessmen, so to say, or owners. Do you feel that it gives Ukrainian voters a real feeling of political debate, or we are far from that? Thank you.
Thank you, Vasyl. Do you hear me? Okay. As usual, in Ukraine we have some innovations, and during this campaign as well. You asked if there are equal opportunities for candidates to access the media. We have a very interesting situation when we have one candidate who is hiding from the media. Maybe it's first time in history. I mean Volodymyr Zelensky, who is very active in entertainment content, in TV shows, in TV series, but this entertainment content he uses not in addition to information and news content, but instead of information and news content. The first highlight from this campaign, I would say that in the beginning of campaign, we saw more candidates in TV news than closer to voting. If in February we saw on TV dozens of candidates, in March, we already saw the battle between two candidates, Poroshenko and Tymoshenko, I mean, again, in news and political talk shows. And Zelensky, despite he was a leader of the race, he was not active in informational content, and he was very active in entertainment formats. That's why at the moment we can say that we know more about his medical analysis than about his political program. I know nothing concrete about his program except of, for example, this thought about NATO. He said on this Sunday in interview on Ukraina TV channel that the question about joining NATO will be voting during referendum. In Ukrainian reality, I would say that in this case, Ukraine will never join NATO. The other highlights from this campaign are, for example, that television on the one hand was very active in different formats. We were flooded by a lot of political talk shows and these guest formats on news TV channels, for example. But unfortunately, we may say that television did not offer voters the real discussion formats. Many talk shows and news programs were like warm buses or some instruments to promote some political ideas or to promote some candidates in populistic manner. The only good example is public broadcaster with his Zvorotny Vidlik program. It was a really good program with fact-checking and it was really useful. And we hope for debates on public broadcaster, but I don't believe that Zelensky will attend it. The other highlights, one of also important trends of this campaign was manipulating by results of sociological researches by TV channels. For example, if some TV channel and its owner didn't like the results of opinion polls, this TV channel, for example, picked up some results which was favorable for him. I mean, for example, who is the leader in one region, not in whole Ukraine, but in one region, and so on. Also, of course, we saw a lot of black public relation during this campaign, and we had two main leaders in black PR. The one leader champion was 1+1 TV channel on the side of Volodymyr Zelensky, and the other leader was Prямyi TV channel on the side of Petro Poroshenko. And also, we may say that this cumulative effect from withdrawal some candidacies from the race did not work for the media. I mean that these cases when Sadovy or other candidates said that they withdraw their candidacies in favor of other candidates. These cases were highlighted in media very poor. And also, we may say that Anatoly Gritsenko failed in positioning of him like the only one candidate from democratic forces. One more issue during this campaign was a question if Russia somehow interfere in elections in media. We monitored on regular basis Russian political TV shows on their TV, and we may say that Russia was very active regarding Ukrainian election. For example, I may give you some figures. For example, we analyzed 183 programs, episodes of this TV show, of this political talk shows, and in 109 programs, Ukraine was mentioned. The main messages in Russian political talk shows regarding Ukraine was that Ukraine is under the external control of the West, Nazism flourishes in Ukraine, and Ukrainian election will be rigged. In more than 50% of these programs, these narratives were disseminated constantly. What is interesting that on Russian television, Ukrainian authorities were humiliated, but at the same time, Russian television praised the people, Ukrainian people, and this narrative about fraternal people, it was mentioned very often in 28% of political TV shows on Russian television. Why this is important and why we can say that it was some influence on voters. On the one hand, we have results of opinion polls that in Ukraine around 4% of people still watch Russian TV on regular basis. 4% it's about 1.3 million people. It's enough, and mostly in southern and eastern parts of Ukraine. On the other hand, we see our monitorings show us that some particular media outlets in Ukraine, Ukrainian media outlets, disseminate Russian narratives on regular basis. I mean such TV channels like News 1, 112, and Inter. And we also have the results of our own opinion poll, and we can prove by these results that those people in Ukraine who watch these Ukrainian TV channels, they perceive situation in Ukraine in more negative way than others. For example, among those people who watch these Ukrainian TV channels, there are more people who think that war in Donbass was started by Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Galyna. Thank you for all experts here in Kyiv studio. So we now have a salad of expert thoughts on campaigning, election observation, media, and results. And we will have 3 rounds of questions, both from DC, Brussels, and Kyiv. And at this point, I want to pass the floor to Jonathan for DC studio.
Great, thank you, and I want to thank all of the presenters and also for everybody bearing with us when we had technical challenges. All of your observations were really both really important and informative. Also lends a lot of questions. And Galyna, the last presentation. You mentioned a couple of things. One was maybe some concerns that that Mr. Zelensky would not show up for debates, and I'm wondering if, as people who, obviously it's so important in this next round for people to Ukrainians, but also partners of Ukraine, to understand fully, as much as possible, what the positions of Mr. Zelensky are, both on NATO, which you mentioned some concerns about, or maybe about his position. You mentioned that you don't think that Ukraine will ever get into NATO. It's a complicated question, but be very much interested to hear people's thoughts about whether or not they think that Zelensky will show up for these debates. Also, how is civil society working in the next 2 weeks to help Ukrainian voters better understand the policy positions of the two presidential candidates, and also all this discussion about debates. Why weren't there debates in the first round, prior to the first round of the election? Why did it have to wait until the second round to have debates? And that way, voters would have had a clearer understanding of the positions of candidates, including Mr. Zelensky. So if I could send it back to Kiev to answer those questions.
Okay, who is ready to start? Galyna or Inna?
I may start.
Okay.
Okay. Talking about debates, it's really interesting because we saw that if before the first round of election all three main candidates ignored the debates, they were not interested in debates. Now, before the second round, Poroshenko is very interested in debates, and we understand why, because he has a chance to be very persuasive during a fair conversation between him and Mr. Zelensky. And Mr. Zelensky is trying to find a tricky way to appear publicly, but at the same time to avoid classical debates with tough questions, with concrete questions about military strategy, economical strategy, and diplomatic strategy, and so on and so forth. Okay, I'm a bit skeptical that these two candidates will meet each other on the same in the same place, whatever at the stadium or in the room of public broadcaster. But maybe at the stadium they have some chance.
Okay. If that's all.
Yes, I lost my thought.
Okay. We have
I'm
Olga
so
now, and
Yes.
then Inna and Professor Haran.
I want to add about debates. So according to electoral legislation, we have two types of debates. One of them is a part of the official agitation from candidates, and any of them, a few of them might organize debate anytime, and they should pay for it officially through their own official electoral fund. So Petro Poroshenko and Volodymyr Zelensky might develop their own rules for debate, understand or decide what will be the place for their debates according to their agitators' plan, and should pay for that through electoral fund. But we are talking mostly about official debates, which should be organized obligatory according to Ukrainian legislation by public broadcasting institution as the third independent TV channel, which will develop their own rules, which will be clear and open for any candidates and for society. And none of candidates might use any videos, promotion, agitators' materials during these debates. And these debates should be organized on Friday, 2 days before election day. So there are some differences between agitation and their plans to agitate through debates and official debates. Because from one hand, public broadcasting should organize the debates even if none of candidates will come. But we know clear what does it mean, the framework for these debates, what should be the rules, how candidates might participate, and so on. And there are a big discussion between candidates, not about the date, but about the type of these debates. In any way, public broadcasting should organize the official debates.
Thank you, Olga. Maybe, Inna, if you may cover the question on what civil society may do. I know you have this app for, to compare the manifestos of presidential candidates. Maybe you could elaborate more on that.
Yeah, first I will probably finish with the debates. Today, Zurab Alasania, the General Director of Public Broadcaster, he announced that the broadcasting of debates from the National Olympijski Stadium will cost approximately 6 million hryvnias. Don't we have other needs to spend this money? So this is, again, a bit populistic invitation, in my opinion, from the candidates, because if they want to debate with each other on some open space with the presence of citizens, Ukrainians, their supporters, they can organize it and to pay from their own money. But as Olga mentioned, the official debates will be organized by public broadcaster, and they will be held even without candidates. We saw it. We saw it when some candidates promised but didn't come to this Zvarodny Vidlik pro-debate or kind of debate expert show. We had quite a high level of discussion among those experts who commented on this. And answering the question about how a civil society can help to understand the positions, well, actually that was the main goal of center year of Chestnut Civil Movement. We were hoping to help Ukrainians to vote rationally. As always, and this information is opened on polithub.org. This is the hugest database on information on politicians who ever campaigned in Ukraine since probably the middle of 90th. And we add the special section to this website where users could compare candidates to presidency like when they're buying mobile phone, like in online shop. They could switch different criteria and to compare with each other several candidates, whether they're interested in their political platforms, in their background on corruption, and background of human rights violations, and so on. And another thing which we've done is the instrument, the test. Again, you could pass it on the Ukrainska Pravda media. It was our project partnership with Ukrainska Pravda, where you could find the main thesis divided to different spheres from the programs of candidates. You could read it like in a wider format or just a main thesis. Then you could answer several questions and find out which candidates actually suits or represents better your own interests. And the results of this test, for example, for me were very surprising, because according to my answers, three quite different, according to the rhetorics candidates like Zelensky, Gritsenko, and Poroshenko suits me in the equally, yeah, 30% each. And it shows that in the majority of cases, the official programs do not correspond to the image, to the reputation, to the track record of certain politicians. What we can help, we will continue probably to spread our newsletters, and we are fundraising openly. Each hryvnia which we collect will be We will print newspapers and spread it in the regions because we are not so romantic. And of course, Ukrainians, they could put likes or share some posts on Facebooks, but the penetration of internet in Ukraine is not so good. And voters, for example, of Poroshenko, according to the polls, the citizens 60 years plus, they were the core voters, for example, of Poroshenko, and they are not active online. But we would love to give them the information about this candidate as well. We are promoting rational voting. We are promoting, first of all, voting. And this is my last thesis. The most important is to come and vote on April 21st, because it's a myth if you are not voting, you do not take responsibility for this politician. This is a myth, because your vote will be used and it will be spread proportionally. You will support the choice of the majority who will come and vote. And today I've changed the place, my temporary place of voting. It took me 3 minutes. But of course, it's because I plan to vote abroad, because I will be in a business trip. But it's possible, and I call and I ask and encourage Ukrainians to use their chance to influence Ukrainian politics for the next 5 years.
Thank you, Ina. And we also have one question uncovered. Professor Haran, maybe you could elaborate more on geopolitics and security issue. And there was a question about Zelensky and his position on NATO and on geopolitics. Could you elaborate more on that? Do we have any clarity?
Yeah. Actually, I would like to see the real debates and to hear finally his position on these issues. Because we know when Mr. Zelensky started to talk about geopolitical issues and also relations with Russia, he appeared to be very inexperienced and actually criticized by all the experts and journalists for naivety of his proposal. So basically then all the views on NATO and EU and Russia, they became more amorphous. He's not talking directly about it. And basically, again, formally he is in favor of EU, and he is not saying that NATO is not for us, but he's talking about NATO and referendum and something like that. Basically, he avoids to give his direct answer on NATO. Why? Because in this case, he may lose support either of pro-NATO, NATO supporters, or those who are not in favor of NATO. So he deliberately avoids this question. And he deliberately avoids not only this question, he deliberately avoids real debates with a sense, because he would need to answer specific concrete actions. And now he is a kind of personage which may to whom different electors may apply, and they project their own views on this personage and think that he will do everything they want, despite the fact that all of them have different approaches. We have also responses from his team regarding foreign policy issues. There were questions that were sent to all the main candidates, and they responded regarding foreign policy issues. It appeared again that at this point his advisors are not experienced in the sphere of foreign policy. For example, they suggested to have action plan on Ukraine become candidate for a membership in the EU, which doesn't exist, this plan. Clearly, they misused it. They heard about membership action plan regarding NATO, and they thought that maybe they should have a kind of this action plan for Ukraine to become a candidate for membership in the EU. But what is even more striking is that they suggested the creation of the office in the government which is responsible for European Euro-Atlantic integration, and this office has been in force for 5 years, headed by Ivanka Klimpush-Tsintsadze, Vice Prime Minister, but they don't know about it. So, I will I will end at the positive note, and I have this positive note. Remember in 2004 when Kuchma was elected, and he was clearly elected on pro-Russian ticket from the voters, strategic partnership.
94, sorry, right?
1994.
94.
I said, sorry, 1994. When Kuchma was elected, strategic partnership with Russia, Russian state language, and all this stuff. And then we saw how his course started to change. And actually, Ukraine started to drift towards Europe, and even the mention of NATO appeared. It was difficult, but the general trend was to the west, not to the east. So basically, if we imagine that Zelensky is elected, it would mean that the West should try to engage with him, to involve him, to educate him and his team. Not easy process, but I think possible way of influencing new president.
Thank you, Professor Haran. So are we done for this round of questions, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think we have one more question here in Washington, and then we'll turn it over to Brussels.
Yeah, one of the panelists said that Zelensky is hiding from the news media. I'm just wondering, how likely is public anger to grow over this issue? In other words, could it become a dominant issue over the next 2 weeks, the fact that he doesn't want to give interviews? And I'm just wondering, how are Ukraine's major TV channels covering that fact that he is not open to the media? And or do the newsrooms not, do the oligarch-controlled stations not really care about that issue?
Thank you. Galyna, maybe we'll
Yes,
start from
it
you.
was also my question. It's really difficult. I know, as far as I know, that's some TV channels which are owned by not by Kolomoisky, but by rivals of Kolomoisky. They at some moment before the first round, they wanted already to invite Zelensky in order to take some comments in news releases from him, and he was hiding from them because he did not trust even to him, because we have some political habits, as you know, not very polite sometimes from the media and journalists. So it's difficult. On the one, what is interesting, I was trying to keep myself from saying this thing, but maybe it's time for it. On the one hand, of course, media experts and journalists and a big part of civil society at the moment is pushing Mr. Zelensky to come to the debates, to come to television, to be more open and to answer our questions, a lot of questions. But on the other hand, I know that we have some guys, again, inside civil society who at this moment, maybe they have some hope to join his team, or maybe they already joined his team, and they try to persuade us not to push him to go to the debates, to the media, because they say us that, you know, guys, it's very difficult for him now to speak loudly, to speak publicly.
Could you repeat the last two sentences? We lost the audio. Could you repeat your last two sentences?
Okay, we have some persons in our civil society who are trusted in civil society, who now maybe have some hope to join his team, the team of Mr. Zelensky, or maybe they already joined his team, who try to persuade us not to push him to be on the TV, to be in the media at the moment, because they say that he has a few experience. Let's help him to win the election, and then we will teach him somehow. So this is a very not easy question.
Thank you, Galyna. Professor Haran, your point.
Well, according to sociological polls, Poroshenko actually has the highest support among people with higher education. It means that those people who think critically, who are making rational choice, this is one thing. And for them, refusal of Zelensky to not to participate in the real debates, to hide from journalists, this is the argument. But we need to understand that for supporters of Zelensky, who believe that this person may save Ukraine and he's a new face which will beat all the other old political generation. For them, it doesn't matter. You know, this is a matter of belief. They believe that. Actually, this is a slogan of Zelensky. We will beat them. That's all. So I am afraid that for many people, it will not have an influence. However, again, as all my colleagues said, this is important. This is important to demand TV debates. And by the way, the debates before the first round formally are not obligatory according to Ukrainian legislation. But debates before the round-off, they are obligatory.
Thank you, Professor Haran. Jonathan, we are done with comments?
Yeah.
When
Great.
Right.
I think we're going to turn it then over to Brussels. Bruno?
Hi, Jonathan. Do you hear us?
Yes, we do.
Yes, we also hear you.
We have a couple of questions here in Brussels. I propose that we collect them all together, and after everyone has asked questions, we turn back to you for answers. So I'm just turning now to the people at the table that have a question. I think we have 2 or 3 of them. So here we go. And please introduce yourself as well.
Hi, my name is Dmitry Shkurko, National News Agency of Ukraine. Before asking the question, short comment. You know, the issue of NATO is not so pessimistic as it was introduced, because of February polls, there was like 44% just could vote for NATO membership immediately, and only like 30% just voting against. And at the same time, at least 60% of Ukrainians supporting the idea of joining EU, and that's mean that if there will be some kind of referendum, people obviously will be supporting NATO membership idea. But now about the question. Question is about mainly to Professor Haran and Madam Ayvazovska. We were discussing the good run of the elections, democratic run, but I believe that we missed one most important point. All the transparency campaign have an aim to give to voters information about candidates. But in that case, as you recognize, we don't know nothing, at least, about the program and intentions of at least one candidate. Don't you think that is the sign that the current legislation in that field is not sufficient enough? And another point of the same issue, just by finalizing. When we hear any person to the state service, they need to pass through some kind of qualification tests. What kind of qualification tests should be for the candidates for the highest position in the state? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this question. Let me take another question around the table here as well, by all means.
Hi, I'm Christina Murphy from the European External Action Service from the Geographical Unit dealing with Ukraine. Can you hear me, right?
Jonathan, do you hear?
Yes, we hear you.
Kiev hear you well, thank you.
I don't hear so well.
I have a follow-up question. Very happy to hear finally some mentioning of the public service broadcaster and what they actually did or tried to do during the elections. This is something the EU has heavily invested in, and this was high on our political agenda as well, trying to promote a independent public service broadcaster, and it will become even more important with view up to the elections coming up in October. So I just would like to have a follow-up question on whether you see any increasing role for them or increasing room of maneuver for the public service broadcaster, especially with some worrying trends or signals that happened before the elections with the dismissal of the head. And
I'm sorry, could you please repeat the question again and more
In
slowly?
concise and clear manner.
Thank
because
you.
we don't
Yes.
hear you.
yes, just if you could, to the Ukrainian NGO representatives, mainly if you see the role of the public service broadcaster becoming more important, maybe due to the October elections.
All right, so the role of the public broadcaster getting more or less important, that's the question. And I have one more question here around the table.
Yeah.
Sophia.
I actually have two questions, but I'll try to make one out of those. So according to the results of the first round, there were people who voted for Poroshenko, mostly the ones who live abroad, not in Ukraine, the ones who voted abroad. Why do you think there is such a difference between those Ukrainians who live abroad and those who voted from Ukraine? And a second question would be, do you think that Poroshenko's campaign has changed after the first round of the elections when he saw that he's not really that popular? It's mostly about media. How did he become more active there? And that question would probably be to Galyna. Thank you.
All right, well, that's it for Brussels. We turn it over to Kiev in Washington for follow-up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruno. I will once again summarize it for our student in Kiev. So the first question was to Professor Haran and Olga Ayvazovska on information about candidates. Is Ukrainian legislation sufficient enough on this issue? Second question was, is there any requirements in Ukrainian constitution and law on a qualification test for candidates, and should or should not it be provided further? A third question was about the role of public broadcasting company. How important is it now? And fourth question was why Ukrainians abroad elected mostly Poroshenko instead of other candidates? And the fifth question was how the Poroshenko presidential campaign will change before the second round voting. So that's it. Olga will start. Thank you.
So about test for candidates, truly it's unconstitutional way, because any of Ukrainian citizen who has 35 years, who were living here during last 10 years, and who has 2.5 million hryvnias might be registered as candidates. There is no any other obligatories or criteria for candidates, and of course it's not so easy to propose anything like that, because it will look like not only unconstitutional way, but it's not about rule of laws, truly. I don't know another European or very like Western country where there are special tests for those people who are going to apply to CEC and to be candidates for presidential election. I don't know if you know about this experience, please share it with us. But truly, it's not about rule of law. About programs and agenda from the candidates, I believe that this time Ukrainian media worked very well with awareness. I can compare with previous campaigning, and so many TV channels showed how to temporarily change the place of voting. What documents should you have to vote, or to talk so much time about voter register, about so-called death voters, and many other things. I think that there are differences between access to information and the quality of this information. Anyone can check the program or agenda, official agenda of the candidates online. Many media try to talk about the position of the candidates, but it doesn't mean that the quality of these programs or agendas were very high. But it's a question to candidates, not to media or voters. And at the same time, there is no a strong, as for me, there is no a strong request from society to have a quality of such programs. Because not so many people believe that the candidates will work according to the agenda during the next 5 years. It's a level of mistrust from one hand, from another hand it's a practices. Sometimes the programs doesn't mean that it is a real agenda of the candidate. Sometimes candidate doesn't know what they wrote in their own agendas, which are present on CEC web portal, and anyone can have access to these programs. That's why the quality of politician, it's not about elections or it's not about legislation. It's about practices, culture, and as for me, it's about requests from society. And this discussion or debates about debates, it's a move forward in this area because there is like an emotional request from society to see both candidates on one platform, but without politically buying experts on the studio, without promotional videos on the studio, without, I don't know, PR and technology, specialists and technologists on this base. So just to watch on two candidates with answers to difficult questions, and that's all.
Thank you, Olga. You actually covered two questions. That's still okay, Professor Haran. You could elaborate on all of them.
I would like to add. There is one more requirement in Ukrainian constitution regarding the candidate. The candidate is to know Ukrainian language, and actually, I think that we know that yes, Mr. Zelensky is doing his best. He's working hard to learn Ukrainian language, but actually I am afraid that by the time when he applied, he could speak freely Ukrainian language. No, he couldn't. Actually, we saw during his not numerous, but some speeches during the campaign that he's saying several phrases in Ukrainian, and then he's switching to the Russian language. But Central Electoral Commission decided it's okay. They registered him, so he's participating in the campaign. So I believe he is to master Ukrainian language in the same way as Kuchma, Yanukovych, and Tymoshenko mastered. But I mean, it's not only the knowledge of Ukrainian language. He needs to understand deeply Ukrainian history and Ukrainian culture. This is even more important because at this point I believe that his knowledge here is limited, but I hope that it will be improved. Regarding voting for Poroshenko in the abroad, well, we can guess. Well, I would say that, as I have said, Poroshenko has a higher support among people with higher education. We understand that Ukrainian immigration and people who are there, mostly they are educated people. They are not paternalistic. They rely on themselves. Proszę? Well, I don't, but I rely on general information about it. So, and perhaps this is information. This is why Poroshenko is ahead. Regarding what he's trying to change, he is trying to change. He's trying to meet with civil activists now. He is recognizing his mistakes now. He said that one of the problems was the absence of strategic communication, especially with civil society, but that's the things that we were talking about during all this year. So basically, he recognizing this mistake, but the question is whether it will influence the electorate enough. Again, as a member of Electoral Council UA, which is where about 30 Ukrainian intellectuals and public intellectuals are united, including Olga is there as well. So we sent questionnaires and called candidates for debate in the first round, and actually only one sent responses to us, and then at the end of the day, this candidate decided not to participate. His name is Sadovy. Now we again officially send the invitations to both candidates. It seems that Poroshenko is somehow interested in that, in meeting with the experts and answering tough questions, but it's not confirmed yet. And I have doubts about Zelensky even ability to meet with experts, non-biased experts.
Thank you, Professor. We still have one question uncovered on role of public broadcaster. Maybe Galyna will elaborate on that a bit later. But Inna, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, just to add that my assumption why Ukrainians abroad voted in the first round for Poroshenko is because they do not watch Ukrainian media, and they watch less investigations on corruption of Poroshenko and his allies, and Poroshenko, as the current president of Ukraine, is of course represents our country on the high-level platforms, and he is quite professional in this, and that is how international media mostly cover his activities. While Ukrainian media are quite full of different investigations, including the corruption in national security and so on. Thank you.
I need to add to that. Look, we are talking not only about the scandals regarding corruptions which are revealed on Ukrainian TV, which is normal and which is actually the result of the revolutions, that we have freedom to criticize president and prime minister on every channel. But the problem is actually Ukrainian media contributed to scandals, to populism, to hysteria, to the atmosphere that everything is lost. Unfortunately, this is also the case. So Ukrainian media, most Ukrainian media, unfortunately contributed to the rise of populism because media preferred not to have serious debates, but preferred to have scandalous talk shows.
I just want to ask our speakers to be very brief, so we could at least take one or two questions from Kyiv studio. Inna and Galyna, okay, Galyna.
So right. I may answer about Poroshenko campaign. Yes, he changed his campaign before the second round, and we have even rumors that he hired new political technologists. What it means, what is new in his campaign? On the one hand, he became more open, and he started to meet with representatives of civil society, and he started to attend political talk shows, not only with comfortable for him interlocutors, but also with a bit criticism towards him. And on the other hand, he became more aggressive. He became active in social media, and he became aggressive. And sometimes, it's my opinion, maybe it's not natural for him, and it's not comfortable for him, because this Sunday he made big hint. He even blamed Volodymyr Zelensky on the air of Ukraine TV channel that Zelensky is a drug addict. And then the next day, on Monday, Poroshenko said that no, I didn't mean that he's drug addict. It's a bit funny. And about public broadcaster, I believe that public broadcaster will be more important before parliamentary elections and will be more important in the next years. But it's rather a story about like English grass. We need 300 years, and it will be very influential, because I agree with my colleagues that not only media prefer to have some show, but not serious debates and serious analytical programs, but also our audience also mostly prefer to watch shows, but not analytical, seriously programs.
to be objective, the whole this discussion about drug dependency and alcohol dependency was, as far as I understand, was started actually by Zelensky team, and then there was exchange of opinions. Yeah.
Okay.
And also by Russia.
Okay.
By Russia towards Poroshenko.
Towards Poroshenko. Okay.
Ina, you had any summarizing comment on all the questions?
All these questions or the whole discussion in general?
Or we just let's pick up one or two questions from Kyiv studio, right?
Yeah.
Okay, guys, we're running out of time, but we will proceed to one or maximum two questions from Kyiv studio. Just question without any commenting.
Andrei Mail, Institute Liberalism. I have one question. What the risk if Poroshenko stay as a president? What the benefits when Zelensky win?
Thank you. And one more, very short, if any. Okay, so it's two questions from Andrei, basically. Good. So, Ola?
I think that it's politically motivated question. So I will not answer to it because it's provocative question. You know why?
No, actually, I don't think. I think then the question is correct. I'm not afraid to try to. It's provocative. No, I don't. No, well, okay, I don't think so. I'm an open guy, a straightforward guy. So I will say, okay, about Zelensky, we were talking quite a lot. Okay, inexperience. So that's why there are risks. Okay, regarding Poroshenko, we know him with all the pluses and all minuses, right? He's promising to change the style, but we don't know to what extent he will be changing. I think actually that results of the first round were cool douche, how to say, cool shower for him. So maybe he will be changing, but we cannot take it for granted. One thing which is clear actually, and this is both plus and minuses, because we will face parliamentary campaign, even if we imagine that Poroshenko is winning presidency, then we may be sure that his faction will not be the largest in the Rada, okay? So there will be a coalition government, there would be a balance, and he will, in order to push his policy forward, he will need to make compromises with all other stakeholders. Some of them are also will be behind the scene. We do not know what would be the results of the parliamentary election. So here you have a plus, that there would be no monopolization of power. For me, this is clear, but at the same time, a minuses, because his space for maneuver would be limited.
I think that no matter who will be elected as the next president of Ukraine, we should pay attention to the parliamentary elections because it would balance the power, of course, and maybe the center of decision-making will switch a bit from the presidential administration to the parliament, and the negotiations there will be hard.
We have 6 minutes left. We have more questions. We can debate.
Okay, any more questions from the studio in Kyiv? I think we are done for the moment. Do we have question in Washington, D.C.? I see.
I think we actually have one additional question in Washington. If you could just hand over the microphone. And just please announce yourself.
Hi, Katerina Sidova here in Washington. I had the privilege of observing the election as well in the first round in Odessa from a Ukrainian diaspora organization. And one of the issues that I think we've observed, and perhaps you can shed light on, is some confusion with registration lists and inability of some voters to actually vote, that they were in the previous registration list but were not in the final list. Could you shed some light on what the Central Election Commission is doing about this issue, and whether there's been any analysis and coverage on how to remedy it in the second round? Thank you.
Okay, there was a fun fact that one of the candidates, Anatoly Hrutsenko, came to the polling station with his wife, Yulia Mostova, the famous journalist, and he voted, but she couldn't have voted because of the problems with registration. Okay, later she found. Wow. But maybe Olga will comment on that.
I think that we have a global problem with the register, because there are many fake news and provocative information about this register. From another hand, we didn't have any independent audit of the quality of the lists. That's why these numbers of information, from one hand, it looks like incidents, but we don't know and we are not sure what is the percentages of the problem. You've talked about previous list and the final list when people could find themselves on the previous but didn't find on the final. I think it's only about like staff problem or human being influence into the and mistakes, you know. But from another hand, we collected the data about the number of other problems. And I think that till that time, when civil society or some independent institution could have access to the data on the registry and could analyze deeply the quality of the list, we will not have any progress on this area. I hope that Ukraine will use for the next electoral circles, but I'm not sure that CEC is ready already to do something like that. As, for example, has Georgia, when the access to it's open data. The register is a part of open data, not as in our country, when anyone can check not only themselves but the list and can assess the list and can understand what is the source of the problem. In our reality, the same developer who prepared the soft now organize administration of the base. This is the problem, that during the last 10 years, we didn't have any internal but deep audit of the quality of the register. But you've told about one example, and it looks like human being mistakes.
Okay, I think we are complete for the moment. Jonathan, I just want to thank the Kyiv studio and people, all the guests who came, all the speakers for your remarkable work, and also our partners, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, the US-Ukraine Foundation, and the Ukrainian World Congress, and other NGOs and CSOs who joined our initiative. And I want to thank you, Jonathan, at the Washington, D.C. studio, and Bruno Lete from Brussels studio. And I want to pass the floor to Jonathan for the last remarks. Thank you.
Vasyl, thank you. And I also want to thank our speakers, RPR, Ukraine Crisis Media Center colleagues in Brussels as well for pulling this together. And again, thank you for everybody's patience with the technical challenges. I think we heard today what was really one of the more comprehensive overviews of the first round of the elections, both in terms of the conduct of the election, key issues that impacted voters, but also now are impacting voters again in the second round. I think we will all be watching here in Washington and Brussels and elsewhere what happens on April 21st. We're also very much interested to see if these debates in Ukraine take place, because I still think there's a lot of questions about positions on issues that have an impact not only on Ukrainians, but also on Ukraine's partners internationally. So I just wanted to thank you, and the Transatlantic Task Force on Elections and Civil Society will pick up again after the second round of the election. We'll be holding our 6th event. And so we would ask everyone please to stay tuned. We'll be sending around a recap of the event. Adrian, I'm looking at you, of this event, and we hope to share that with you as well. And again, thank you everyone for participating. Oris, do you have anything you wanted to add to it? Okay, great. Thank you, Brussels. Thank you, Kiev. And thank you to our participants again for joining us, and everyone here in Washington who came here early in the morning. Thank you. And have a good afternoon and good evening. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Слухайте, а Кармаз